Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachita Gupta, and I'm the Global Coordinator of Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. Welcome to our press conference today. On Saturday, more than 70,000 people marched along the streets of Belém in Brazil to tell the leaders of the world, no more delay and genuine climate action now. Indigenous peoples, frontline communities, climate justice movements, queer and trans persons, youth groups, fisherfolk, peasants, workers both formal and informal, women, families, and concerned citizens united under the People's Summit Grand March, carrying the message to demand an end to colonialism and occupation, to respect indigenous people's rights and frontline communities, for a fair, funded, equitable phase-out for fossil fuels, a just, inclusive, and popular transition, and the Global South demands for reparations. Today we are gathered in this press conference to discuss what is the current state of play and to talk about Global North's obligations to pay for their historical responsibility. As we begin, we want to say that all of us have no ties to any fossil fuel industries or any Zionist entities, and we declare this voluntarily. We also stand in solidarity with the indigenous groups that are marching outside for their right to be heard inside, but are being extensively restricted by the military police outside. We'll first hear from our first speaker, Meena Raman from Third World Network.
Good morning. Last week, there was a lot of work on the technical side of matters. This week, the ministers have come, and there's supposed to be political guidance given by the ministers. Going by what we see in the halls of the negotiations, and we have reports of this, and you can, both for those of you who want more details, please go see what is being said in the halls. But what's shocking is really that you have the Global North countries once again come to these halls and come to these meetings and talk that they ask the question, why is everything on meeting ambition? They talk about the 1.5, the need to have the 1.5 achieved. They talk about showing more ambition. But if you look at what they are doing, this is not about ambition, but it's about shifting the burden of responsibilities to the developing countries, and they do not want to talk about their financial obligations. And I'll explain how. So if you look at the discussion on what developing countries have been calling for in terms of a political space to talk about the provision of climate finance, this is called the Article 9.1 conversation of the Paris Agreement. Now, I'm not sure whether the Global North understand English, but it's so clear that this says that developed countries shall provide finance for mitigation and adaptation. And there's also a responsibility for loss and damage finance. But what we see happening here, we have the developed world having the gall to say that why is everything on ambition, particularly on mitigation, linked to finance? But that's what the Paris Agreement says. This is respecting the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. It's about their obligations. This is not charity. This is not overseas development assistance. And yet, and this is what I just heard from the rooms where they are discussing under the presidency consultations on what is what they call the agenda issues. So the discussion here, when somebody like the European Union raises the point of why is this linked to finance, is baffling, because that's what the legal treaty says. The second thing that we notice is that the last year, the big issue was the new collective quantified goal on finance, on the 300 billion per year. That was a mobilization goal, which the United States in particular made very clear. It's not a provision goal, it's a mobilization goal. But they come here, the rest of the world, the rest of the developed world, they come here and they say, but we have provided finance, and we are providing finance. If they are providing, then why are they reluctant to have a political space to be provided to talk about what they are providing? In fact, they should lead. They're happy to talk about the provision of finance because they say they are providing. And what is, to make matters worse, what we see happening also, when you look at the decision from Baku last year, there is a paragraph which refers to tripling the outflows of finance from the multilateral climate funds, which includes the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, and we would also say the Loss and Damage Fund. But there is no reference to inflows. Now, there was in the text, as far as I understand it, from Baku, the tripling of financial inflows to these multilateral climate funds. Now, that was deleted at the sleight of hand of the United States. So how can you triple the outflows when you don't have the inflows? Now, this is really problematic. So when you come here, and the United States is not here, but the global north has not changed their tactic. They have not changed their voice, and they are still doing the Great Escape. And on the issue of the nationally determined contributions, they want to talk, the NDC synthesis report, about how the assessment shows that parties are off track. We didn't have to have the NDC synthesis report to know that. But who is responsible for the pre-2030 gap? The biennial communications, which the European Union wants to talk about, says very clearly that the developed countries are not on track to meet their pre-2020 emissions gap. So why do they talk about wanting to talk about it? And they do not want to talk about historical responsibility. They are deleting CBDR and diluting it wherever. They don't want to talk about the convention. So what you see happening here is a lack of good faith. It's really about, once again, charting the Great Escape, shifting the burden to the developing world, and they are not about saving multilateralism. If multilateralism has to be saved, you have to go according to the rules which are there in the convention, which are there in the Paris Agreement. And don't come and play games and have smokes and mirrors to say that they are about multilateralism. So we cannot accept that. This is against climate justice. This is actually climate injustice. So enough is enough. Stop the Great Escape and stop playing games and be true to the Paris Agreement and the convention and honor your obligations. This is our call.
Thank you so much, Meena. We'll next hear from Liddy Nakpil from Asian People's Movement for Debt and Development.
Good noon to everyone. Unlike Meena here, I haven't been around COPs as long as she has, but I have been to 17 COPs. And throughout these many years, it's been the same story, the same claims, the same hypocrisy. We call it climate hypocrisy that we see, especially from the governments of developed countries or the global north. Because they are the ones who have been, as Meena says, styling themselves as pro-ambition, pressuring developing countries to be, they say, more ambitious because they are supposed to be lacking in ambition. But there are two things that we need to look at. We need to look at what they are actually doing and what the governments of the developing countries are actually also doing. So on this, we are part of a study that looked at the NDCs and the performance of governments in the last 10 years, since 2015, since Paris, and also taking a look at the newly submitted NDCs by different parties as of last month. And they do not tell a different story. So for the 10 years, our study shows that the biggest gap between what must be delivered as their fair shares and what has actually been delivered is that of the global north. I think for many of us, this is not surprising, but this has to be repeated in view of the fact that they are claiming to be the champions of ambition. So the biggest gap between what was actually delivered and what should be their fair shares is on the side of the developed countries. And of course, what is their fair share and their actual pledge? There is also that gap. And so even based on their pledges in their NDCs, they have fallen short. And in the last 10 years, if we look at developing countries, as a group, aggregate, they have been meeting fair shares. Of course, we cannot say the same if we look at individual countries. We have to acknowledge that among developing countries, there are those who meet their fair shares, there are those who exceed their fair shares, and there are those who are also falling short. But as a group, they cannot be claimed to be less ambitious than the global north. One of the things we also looked at is not just the actual delivery of emissions reductions on the global north, because we insist, and the Climate Convention also says, that part of the obligations of the global north is the delivery of climate finance, which Mina has been also emphasizing. Even just on the question of mitigation, climate finance is part of the mitigation fair shares of global north, because their share in the historical accumulated emissions is so large that to make up for that share, it's not enough for them to reach zero emissions domestically. They need to make up for more than that, so they need to make more mitigation actions possible. And where else will that be but in the global south? So the global south, of course, must meet its fair share. Unfortunately, we need to do more than our fair share, not for our sake, but for the sake of the entire planet. We cannot do that without finance. It's a matter of principle and a practical requirement. A principle because we are owed that climate finance. A practical requirement because we really won't have anywhere to get that money. Given all the needs, given the impoverishment, the exploitation, the plunder that's happening in the South, that climate finance must be delivered. So we are here to insist climate finance, which is central to every topic, from mitigation to adaptation to loss and damage to just transition, that has to be delivered as part of reparations and as a practical requirement for saving all of humanity and the planet. We are not here to plead for our case, to ask for charity or for assistance or for aid. This is for all of the people in the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liddy. We'll now hear from Tom Goldtooth from the Indigenous Environmental Network.
On? Yeah.
Tom, you just speak into the mic, it will turn on.
Okay, I got it. It's a run over here. The NDCs at this COP30 were supposed to be the ones to align the 1.5 Celsius climate limit that science and justice demand, but no. This is the conference of the perpetrators, representing more than 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists, given admission to this COP30. This UN climate conference has been promoting a new initiative called the Global Ethical Stocktake, focusing on moral, ethical, and cultural elements of addressing the climate crisis, including addressing the impact of the poor, the vulnerable and disadvantaged people, on women and children, and indigenous peoples. It is unethical to give access to these big polluters that continue a road of ecocide, terroricide, and genocide against the rights of Mother Earth, Father Sky, nature, and humanity. It is immoral to call this the Indigenous Peoples COP, when local Indigenous peoples are forced to lift up their voices outside the gates of the COP to gain entry, when the fossil fuel lobbyists can waltz right in with no struggle. In summary, some of our Indigenous Environmental Network priorities here in Belém is to strengthen the legal protections for Indigenous peoples, land defenders, and the rights of nature. Nature is not a resource, but a source of life. As Indigenous territories harbor critical carbon sinks and biodiversity hotspots, greater recognition and legal protections are needed to protect lands, rivers, forests, and all of nature as endowed with rights. We are still struggling in language as our Indigenous members of our caucus are lobbying the different nation states, the staff, just to get stronger language on rights of Indigenous people, especially the inherent, distinct, collective rights of Indigenous peoples within the Just Transition work group plan. So we're continuing to speak up our voice as Indigenous peoples, demanding the recognition and upholding Indigenous jurisprudence and governance systems. The United Nations should formally recognize Indigenous legal systems and customary governance. That's very vital. We're addressing grievance procedures in all areas, including Article 6, as we're very distrustful of the architect and implementation standards that are developed. In summary, many of our demands are to really look at the complicated scenario with the TFF. This project, we're very cautious. It's not directly red related or using carbon, but it's like a bank finance system that's going to create indebtedness to many communities and countries. That forest fund is governed by the Brazilian government. As we know, we are still in dialogue with Indigenous representatives here in the COP to really analyze this better and find out how and is it an innovative finance, quote unquote, that is being promoted. So the TFFF mistakenly and misleadingly considers deforestation a market failure that will be resolved by putting yet another price on the ecosystem services of tropical forests to attract private investment. The ecological collapse caused by capitalism will not be solved with more capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. We'll now hear from our last speaker, Leon Seeley Higgins, who's the senior campaigner for climate justice and just transition at War on Want.
Thank you very much. So there's a major struggle for just transition at this COP. But what is it and why does it matter? Well, I'll start with a little bit of an anecdote about where I'm from. I'm from a city called Birmingham in the center of England, the UK. Last week, we had over 30 millimeters of rain in one day. My roof started leaking. Cars were washed away. The playground where my children play was flooded. At the same time, a few weeks ago, the far right started putting up Union Jack flags on the lampposts of the main high street down the road from us. And it's a cliche to say it, but I'm terrified of the future that my kids face and the present that they're increasingly facing. When they go to hospital, they increasingly have to wait for longer and longer to see a doctor. And their schools can't afford the basic materials that they need for education. And all this is bearing in mind that I'm from an extremely privileged position globally. This is the context of their version of the transition. It's not a just transition. It's one that maintains the inequalities of climate apartheid, where billions of people across Latin America, the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa face deadly storms, hunger, and displacement. Their transition does not protect workers in industries in decline. It doesn't keep the working class in rich countries safe from flooding and fuel poverty. Their transition instead protects the wealth of the 10% who emit nearly half of all global emissions, and who use that stolen wealth to build private bunkers, to hire private armies, and try and protect themselves from the storms that they themselves have created. Their transition stems from a system shaped by colonialism and imperialism, as we've heard about the unfair nature of the unfair shares. And their system is designed to lock the poor in poverty and keep the marginalized marginal. Instead, we're fighting for a holistic vision of just transition. And a holistic vision is one that would respond to the full reality of the crises that we face. That's the only thing that can challenge those fascists who are in my city putting up flags on lampposts. Here, political institutions and arrangements, the basis for international cooperation, are in a precarious position amidst the context of ongoing genocide, military violence, and trade wars. The UNFCCC, imperfect as it is, remains an essential space to advance globally just transitions. Strong policies here could provide an anchor nationally, locally, and regionally to create mechanisms for accountability to support initiatives for just transition in different domestic contexts. As part of our efforts to pursue this vision of a globally just transition, last week our collective action managed to achieve a huge step forward. It resulted in the majority of parties who represent the majority of people globally supporting our calls, the calls of workers, communities, women, youth, and indigenous peoples for a global just transition mechanism, the catchily named BAM, the Belém Action Mechanism. The BAM could be a transformative, equity-centered mechanism aligned with people's demands. It could serve as a place to initiate action on all aspects of just transition. So not only the transition away from fossil fuels, but also addressing the scramble for critical minerals, which is seeing imperialism reproduce across the global south. Also addressing the food and agricultural systems, which routinely produce destructive impacts whilst not even feeding people. It could also address the absence of attention to care work, as well as many other things. This is what we're fighting for. It would also provide support and technical assistance for implementation across the global south and even for countries in the north. It would facilitate shared knowledge and capacity. Yet the story, as you've heard already, is the same as usual. Rich countries are blocking. The EU is refusing to commit. The UK, my country, is running scared from its historical responsibilities. A few weeks ago, over 50 of us, climate and social justice organizations, trade unions, wrote to our Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband. We produced this open letter. We asked them to call to back climate justice at COP, and yet they still refuse to support our calls for a mechanism. If this is supposed to be the implementation COP, then the global north needs to step up. They need to back the BAM, they need to commit to transformative, just, equitable, and ecological transitions, and deliver a real transition to undermine the far right, to repair the leaky roofs, to provide the flood defenses, to provide the schools with the tools that they need, to provide everybody with access to education and healthcare. That's what support for a globally just transition at this COP could mean. So we need no more delays. We need to deliver just transition now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. We'll now open the floor for questions. We'll now open for questions from the floor. Please introduce yourself. Please introduce yourself and your organization when you raise your question. We prioritize questions from media before the general public here. Please feel free to raise your hand.
Hi, my name is Esteban. So I've been following the discourse on what we've been saying about the global north sort of blocking crucial negotiations. But in the absence of the US, Meena, Lydia, who are the parties that you see in the halls? We know with just transition, the UK particularly is not very, very supportive of the mechanism. But like, can you just tell us a little bit more about who are these parties so we can just hold them accountable at home?
Sorry, there's not any other questions? This is the only round of questions we have, so please raise your hand if you have any other questions. No? Okay. Oh, yeah, okay. Jara?
Yeah. I'm Jaren Brown with Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and I just wanted to ask if you could also talk about how the carbon market mechanisms that Mr. Goldtooth spoke to relate to the question of the NDCs at this COP.
Okay, thanks. Maybe we can go by order. 1 minute each. Meena, Liddy, Tom, and then Leon.
Well, all of them, I mean, the first question about who's responsible, I mean, who's blocking or who's not advancing, it's quite clear all the developed countries are together. I mentioned that. There is no one country here who says that, we want to engage, we want to fight, engage in a conversation or a political space to talk about the provision of finance. All of them are very happy not to talk about the provision of finance. They're very happy to talk about the mobilization. They're very happy to talk about how the MDBs must do more, how the private sector must do more, how developing countries in a position to do so, to do more. Everybody else under the sun except them. But they do say that we are providing. So this is why we are saying, if you are saying so, then come to the table and allow the conversation in good faith so that it's very clear what you are actually providing.
Thanks. Liddy.
Yeah, just to answer the question about market mechanisms, there's two things. One, they are very harmful for actual mitigation efforts because market mechanisms are supposedly to enable more mitigation, but it's really about carbon credits and carbon credit trading. So it's not, which has not been proven to be effective in all these many years since the Kyoto Protocol introduced all this carbon trading and offsets. Secondly, it's about making money. And this is why supposedly this carbon trading, for instance, and offsets are being encouraged because then the private sector will come in, they can make money off of it, so people will then, our countries will then be encouraged to have more carbon emissions reductions so that they can sell the credits. But as again, all of this is about making money, and now they've introduced these market mechanisms as a way of mobilizing climate finance. So when Mina was saying that they're not going to provide it, but they're going to actually mobilize it, they mean they're going to mobilize from the private sector. That's what they mean primarily, and they're going to do that through also these market mechanisms and other mechanisms like using public finance for incentives and de-risking private sector investment in climate action.
Thanks, Liddy. Tom?
Yes, it's a big issue. Some of our delegation that were there in Paris in 2015, our international indigenous rights attorney said the Paris Agreement is nothing but a trade agreement. And that's why it's very critical when we look at carbon markets and the NDCs and how they're linked from the Paris Agreement's Article 6. That's why there's a lot of attention on Article 6, 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8 that allow countries to use market mechanisms to achieve their NDC climate targets. So a lot of countries are working with the polluting industry to greenwash. They're not really cutting back on the emissions or the production and mining of fossil fuels, but increasing. So carbon markets enable basically countries to trade in carbon markets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. We'll close by saying there's no climate justice without Palestinian liberation. Please join us here on 19th for our next press conference. Thank you.